Hi, Josh.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Very well indeed. I'm in Vermont. This is my little vacation time, but of course, I've been working on Syria every day.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt your vacation. I guess it seems to have gotten you in a state of mind where you stoically endured some tech issues I inflicted on you for the last 15 minutes. I appreciate your sticking around. Let me introduce this. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of Nonzero newsletter. You are Joshua Landis, professor at the University of Oklahoma, and director of the Center of Middle East Studies and a fellow at the Quincy Institute. You are, I would say, one of America's foremost experts on Syria. And that's what we're going to talk about. Inevitably, we'll wind up talking about some other countries, including Israel and Iran. But just to set this up a little, so last time you were on, which was, I don't know, 6, 7 months ago, in the wake of the fall of the Assad regime, and its displacement by a, I guess you could say rebel coalition, but very clearly led by a guy who's now called Ahmed al-Sharaa, and who is now the president. You were, I would say, very guardedly optimistic about the prospects of Syria. First of all, being a unified, cohesive state that was more or less stable, an ethnically inclusive state, possibly, notwithstanding the jihadist past of the current leader, which he claims to have put behind him. There were times when he was very sectarian. Um, and also the prospects for Syria being even maybe potentially a stabilizing force in the region. I would say regardedly optimistic. The last couple of weeks have raised these issues anew. I would guess you're not feeling super optimistic right now, but I don't know. Let me just quickly give you my understanding from just reading news accounts of some of what happened. Uh, it's being described in different ways. First of all, what clearly happened is a bunch of people died in Syria in conflict in a region of it called, I guess, Suwaida or something.
Wait,
Uh,
it's the capital of the Jebel Druze, Jebel meaning mountain, the Druze Mountains, where about 3% of Syria's population are Druze, a religious community.
mhm.
But Sweda, the capital city, it's also the governorate of Sweda. The capital city is a mixed city, and there are about 3% Bedouin who live in Sweda. There's also
Okay.
7% Christians, and the rest are Druze.
Okay, so the Druze are the majority, and it's 3% Bedouin. Because the initial, I mean, this has been described in various ways. It's been described as ethnic conflict between the Druze and the Bedouin, and the government is saying it just sent forces there to quell the violence. Uh, Other people are saying, well, no, the government was really intent on oppressing the Druze. Israel intervened via aerial bombardment, not just in the vicinity of the conflict, but actually bombed Damascus, including targets near the presidential palace. So it's very complicated. Before you describe what happened from your point of view, can you just briefly give us a sense of the challenges Syria inherently poses to anyone who wants to make it a cohesive and unified and ethnically inclusive state? In other words, there is some degree of, there are different ethnic groups, Druze, Kurds, Bedouin among them, Alawites, who were in, good shape pretty much under the Assad regime and are more insecure about their status now. And what I guess what else would you say about the challenge the government faces before we get into what actually unfolded
Right.
recently?
Well, the challenge that the government faces is centralizing authority. We have to remember that Ahmed Shara, who leads Syria, was the head of Al Qaeda. And he was a member of ISIS for a while, a brief while, but he was the head of Al Qaeda for a long time in Syria. He started a very successful militia. And so he has morphed over time because he left al-Qaeda. He renamed his group, the Nusra Militia, which was al-Qaeda in Syria, meaning victory, Nusra. And he was sent by Baghdadi, Caliph Baghdadi, to open a branch of al-Qaeda in Syria. He did so with great success. But once the rebels began to be pushed by the government had success with Russian backing, Iranian backing, and pushed the rebels up into the north of Syria. He left al-Qaeda, and he needed international support. So he began to change his look, which was to rename his group. It ultimately became Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, and he tried to change his names because he wanted to get off the international terrorist list, America's terrorist list. He needed foreign aid and he needed Turkish backing, and everybody was pushing him. You've got to get out of the terrorism business and al-Qaeda, and he did. And he started a regime in Idlib province that many Americans would later go and give him advice, and NGOs started getting involved there. And the Turks, of course, were his main military backers. So when he took over Damascus in December 2024, he came with a big legacy. And that legacy was a background of al-Qaeda and being Salafi jihadist. Mm-hmm. Now, he was presenting himself as somebody totally new, but the minorities in Syria, about 30% of Syrians are minorities, and you've already named the biggest ones. The Alawites are about 12%. They're on the coast. They're a religious minority. They're Arab. The Turks are in the northeast. The Kurds are in the northeast. They're an ethnic minority. They're Sunni Muslim, but they're an ethnic minority that wants autonomy and has distrusted the Arab majority, because Syria has always been named the Syrian Arab Republic. Mm-hmm. And the Kurds insist it should be the Syrian Republic tout court, because they don't want to have an ethnic marker, because then it excludes them from the nation. So then the Druze are 3% in Sweda, and they're down by the Golan Heights on the Jordanian border and not very far from the Israeli border. And of course, they're Druze. There are about 150,000 Druze in Israel. They fight in the military. Israel is very attached to them. They're Druze in Lebanon.
They fight in Israel's military.
They do. And so Netanyahu gets pressured and gets lobbied by the Druze minority in Israel to do something about the Druze in Syria. And of course, he's got much larger strategic ambitions as well, but he can't be insensitive to the pressure of the Druze.
And don't the strategic ambitions more or less coincide with the pleadings of the Druze in Israel, in the sense that wouldn't he just as soon keep Syrian government forces outside of the majority Druze part of Syria?
Yes, as soon as this gets us back to the legacy of Ahmed al-Sharaa. Uh-huh. His legacy as the leader of al-Qaeda, Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, was his nom de guerre. He switched that name as soon as he took Damascus. And his legacy precedes him, because the minorities are scared, and they were scared that, he is really a wolf in sheep's clothing. And that despite his normalization by America and by President Trump and by the Arab countries and the international community as a whole has embraced him as the best outcome, he's the guy who's got Damascus. We've got to deal with him, because what's the alternative is their argument. But the minorities have not been reassured. And there have been massacres on the Alawite coast where close to 2,000 Alawites were killed. And there have been a steady stream of violations with, people calling the minorities horrible things. In May, the Druze were attacked. They were accused of, a Druze sheikh was accused of insulting Muhammad. And there was a call for jihad, and people took it up. Students were chased out of their dorm rooms in universities from Aleppo to Homs, excuse me. And and Damascus. And Druze were attacked in their towns outside of Damascus. So the minorities are very fearful that this guy, if he's allowed to overtake them, his forces are going to mistreat them as unbelievers, as filth, and they're going to steal and rob and take their homes and treat them very badly, which is what's been happening on the Syrian coast.
And can I ask you a question? In your opinion, I mean, there are two kinds of explanations for this. To the extent that government-affiliated forces have been involved in bad behavior, and in some cases they would say, "Well, we didn't start it. It was initially, for example, an Alawite militia or something." And maybe in some cases they're right, but in any event, I don't think anybody denies that there have been excesses, to say the least, committed by government.
You're right. I mean, this is a larger problem of centralization, as you say.
Right.
And the Alawites felt like they were being mistreated, and they were being mistreated. In the name of transitional justice, regime forces were coming into the Alawite villages, dragging people they considered to be guilty out of their homes and shooting them.
And there were guilty among the population because so many of Assad's troops and henchmen had been Alawites, right? So
they have served in the army, and as has many Syrians, because the vast majority who served in the army were Sunnis. But the Alawites served in the army, and of course they were officers, and many of the high officers fled. And so the question is, who is guilty? Right. This is the same question we had after Vichy France, and we had after the American Civil War, is how do you punish the losing side and for the terrible things that they have done? And in theory, this should be brought to the courts, and courts should have a court case. Names should be named of which Alawites are considered guilty by the state. Are you going to punish down to the colonel level, to the major level, lieutenant, the enlisted soldier? Who is guilty? And how do you check for that? And do you have it in a court, or is it done, by walking to somebody's house and saying, "Who are you?" And the trouble is we've seen a lot of these infractions where women get killed and children get killed, and there is no, it's just very far from anything that's justice. And there's a lot of houses that are being taken because people want to live in them. So
and can I ask you, with regard to these kinds of excesses and crimes in general, directed against the Alawites, the Druze, whoever, do you have a view on the extent to which this actually represents the wishes of President al-Sharaa, and to what extent it represents the fact that he began governing with a kind of somewhat unruly coalition, presumably, including various rebel groups? And I assume that when you try to turn this into a government, you have to accommodate the more powerful of these by saying, okay, you're part of the military. So typically in these cases, when things like this happen, these bad things, it may be that the directive comes from the top, and it may be that the guy at the top would like to control them and is unable to. Do you have a view on the extent to which these two things, either of these is the problem?
Yes. Well, Ambassador Barak, who is the American ambassador to Turkey and special envoy to Syria, has argued consistently that these sorts of violations are because of a lack of capacity, is the way he explains it. That Sharaa doesn't have the kind of troops he needs. He's not fully in control of his troops. He has brought, as you've just described, a whole roster of militias, some of them foreign, into the Syrian army. And, there's probably 4,000 foreign fighters, probably more than that. Foreign fighters, Turkmen, Uyghurs, so forth, who've been brought in and made soldiers. And so there's a panoply of people, many of whom fought in al-Qaeda or other very bloody groups that were Salafi jihadists, that are imbued with a deep sense that these religious minorities are not only non-Muslims, that they've left, they're apostates who've left Islam. They deserve to be killed or converted. And, this mentality of jihad is, they've been fighting for the last 14 years. So this is what makes minorities very fearful, because the guy knocks on the door and he says, I'm from security, and you don't know who he's going to be and what mentality he's going to bring, and whether he cares whether Ahmed Sharaa has given him orders or what orders. And they're getting very mixed orders, because we hearing of officers who are telling people just to, go and shoot every Alawite or shoot every Druze. And this is happening. And we hear, there's infinite recordings of, for example, Bedouin leaders whose over 40 Bedouin tribes were mobilized by the Sharaa administration to come and fight against the Druze, who were resisting centralization. And then news people interview these sheikhs, and they said, we're going to get we're going to get the Druze, we're going to kill them, we're going to do this. And they say these blood-curdling things. Of course, they're being wound up to go put hate in their hearts and fight. So the question then becomes, does the government, are they using these Bedouin tribes as sort of shock troops in order to deflect blame from the results of what's going to happen, because their own troops are not strong enough? And increasingly, minorities are beginning to believe that this is a strategy being used by the central government. Now, the central government's supporters are saying, no, absolutely not. It's not a strategy. This is the fact that you've got regime change. You've got no institutions in Syria. And of course, Sharaa stripped all those institutions. They were in shabby shape after 14 years of civil war. But there was a police force. There were many other, institutions and ministries. All of the people who were in them were fired. So it's not just they were in terrible shape, but they were completely disassembled. And understandably so, because Sharaa didn't want the kind of people that Assad had appointed and had been trained over the decades in his ministries. And they weren't going to be followers, and he needed to find jobs for his own followers. So there are all of those pressures on him to just get rid of them, in the same way that Iraq got rid of.
And we saw what happened there. A formidable Sunni insurgency developed, powered largely by the people who had been in power and had been kicked out of power.
Right. The Sunni minority in Iraq, which was 20%, went on the warpath. And
because they've got the guns, for one thing, and I assume there's still some of that here with the Alawites. I assume a lot of them hung on to their rifles.
200 or so Alawites took up guns because of these infractions. Now, the big question is, was this a conspiracy to bring back Assad, as the government said, that they're Assad people who are trying to resurrect the regime with Iranian backing and so forth? Or were these people who were defending themselves because there was no real transitional justice? There was just transitional injustice, if you will, and people were losing their houses. And so the question then is, who's really to blame here? Who started? But you have a regime change. You have two different forces: the minorities who distrust these ex-Al-Qaeda guys who are marching in to mete out justice. How do you reassure them that they're not going to just be dragged out back and shot? And it's very hard. My own family, Alawite family, I'm married to an Alawite. My mother-in-law, the family was cautiously optimistic. They understood that Assad was brutal, corrupt, had driven the country into a dead end, and he had nowhere to take people. They were relieved. They wanted something new. They, of course, were very worried that Sharaa was the wrong person to do this, but for the first 3 months, his troops were quite polite. They were orderly, and there was calm in the country.
I remember in our last conversation, you said that, I think you said your brother-in-law, he had vacated some area out of fear initially, but it seemed like the coast was clear and he had even maybe gone back there or something. I may be misremembering
During the
this.
first 3 months, that was the feeling. But
Mhm.
then in March, there were these widespread massacres in the Alawite Mountains in response to an Alawite ambush of regime troops on the main road. There had
Okay.
been tit for tat going back and forth. Um, so, and there have been, demonstrations in Latakia and the big cities where people were saying Alawites are disgusting, they're pigs, they're so forth, we're going to punish you. So the fear factor had developed in a very profound way. The lack of, so this fighting broke out. Then the regime called for a national mobilization. And this call for a national mobilization then went to the mosques, where a general Nafir al-Am and a general mobilization, and then calls for jihad started to come out from radical sheikhs in the mosques.
Mhm.
And then you got all these militias that began to just stream down to the coast. Some of them were government militias that had been brought into the government and given, uniforms by the government, but they were following their own leaders and they're following their own way of doing things. And they were following jihad, and they massacred people right and left. One cousin had her house broken. 5 cousins had their houses broken into, of my wife. But one of them,
Mhm.
their son was dragged out, a 21-year-old that played with my son as we grew up, and was shot summarily. He'd never
Oh
served
God.
in the army. He was the only breadwinner for the family. The wife was
And he was killed just because he was a young male Alawite.
Yes, yes. I mean, he had never lifted a gun in because you're an only son does not serve in the military in Syria. You get a
Mm.
get out of jail free card if you're the only son. So um, he had never served. And anyway, the point is that this is just these things are happening because they're Alawites, and that created great distrust.
And
Then,
is it your view that al-Sharaa, the president, if he had, if he could do it, he would be happy to build the ethnically inclusive state he claims he wants to build for the sake of having a unified and coherent state that he controls throughout its territory, but he just hasn't played his hand as deftly as you need to play it to do that under the circumstances? Or are you kind of agnostic? Because, of course,
you
all,
don't
all of
really
his enemies are depicting the source of the evil as at the top, as people tend to do. It's like he hasn't changed his stripes. That's why this regime is unacceptable, and so on.
when he first the trouble is he's surrounded by all these people who, for 20 years, fought, whether it's in Iraq or Syria,
Uh huh.
for jihad.
Right.
And they raised the flag of jihad, and they were extremists. How do these people get converted overnight into thinking in a different way about Syria, as Syrians are equal? They don't. That's the trouble. And we saw, for example, in Humps, when he first started hiring new people into the police force, we saw police commandants who were his officers at a graduation class, for example, making the recruits, the new graduating recruits, chant things like, "What is our way? Sabilina, Sabilina, what is our way?" And they would say it's jihad. And then, "What is our constitution?" They say it's the Quran. And these were the chants that were going call and response back and forth between. So this was, of course, what happens when militiamen get recruited into Al Qaeda. You're going to be indoctrinated with jihad and the Quran.
Mm-hmm.
But that same indoctrination has been is being carried over. It's bleeding into the police force, that's general security, and these people who are knocking on doors. So if you're somebody who's getting their door knocked on, you don't know what attitude the person behind that gun is going to have towards you.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the problem. His Minister of Interior, Hassan Khattab, who has been close to Sharaa for ever. Fought with him in Iraq, 2008, came to as part of al-Qaeda in Syria, helped him build it up. A right-hand man who's been in charge of his personal security, many other things, is now the Minister of Interior. So he's in charge of the entire police force and securing the country. He's written many books. 2015, he wrote a book on Sunni jihad and its possible downfalls. And the first third of the book, which I read the other day, is about how you can't get suckered in as a good Sunni jihadist. You cannot get suckered into democracy, secularism. And these are Western ideologies that take you away from the Quran and belief in God, which they do, of course, because they promote constitutions which are man-made, not God-made. You're supposed to have God's law, Sharia law, and follow the Quran. You're not supposed to follow a man-made document like a constitution, where men make the laws and are raising themselves up to the level of God in making laws and deciding on truth in a constitution. That is, it's called shirk. Shirk is putting a man up to the level of God. So you're polytheism. And that's what many of these jihadists accuse people who want democracy or a constitution. There's a big billboard that was erected on the main highway that said, "Demokratia shirk." Democracy is shirk, is apostasy. And on the bottom, it says, "This is brought to you by your brothers, the mujahideen, the jihad fighters," because they're lobbying the government not to abandon these principles. And this book is written by the Minister of Interior.
Of course, you can imagine something that's not a democracy, but is ethnically tolerant. That's possible in principle.
Oh, absolutely. There are many countries. I mean, you take Jordan, you take there are many monarchies, for example, in the Middle East or others that are tolerant. The question then is, how do you get there? And how, Ahmed Shara has said over and over again, "I'm building a Syria for all Syrians and for every component," so forth. But you look at his constitution, the constitution he promulgated, which is called an interim constitution, but it's interim for 5 years. And it gives all power to the president. The president does not have a prime minister. He does have vice presidents, but none have been appointed. He appoints the entire parliament. 1/3 are appointed directly, and the other 2/3 are appointed by a committee that he appoints. The Supreme Court is all appointed by him. The military is run by him. He can make laws or veto laws. In fact, there's no parliament to make laws right now. He's just running the entire show, and in the Constitution, he's allowed to do that.
Has he made parliamentary appointments and judicial appointments so that we're getting a sense for whether he's going to try at least to have, even if token, representatives of different ethnicities?
He's named a government with ministers. And there is one Alawite minister who is head of transportation. There is one woman who's also a Christian, which is the Christian minister.
Well, I imagine he's got followers who aren't delighted about that. So I guess he gets a little credit. But anyway.
Well, he can appoint to his cabinet and say, "I have a minister from each thing. This is diverse." The trouble is the 5 ministers that really do all the heavy lifting, like interior, defense, foreign minister, so forth. They're all from Tahrir al-Sham. They're all from al-Qaeda. They're all his longtime followers. He's not going to let any power out of his hands. He's building a government that's very similar to what Assad's government was, with a small bunch of elite people who've been loyal to him for decades.
Yeah. Now, I want to get back to the question of how optimistic you ultimately are or aren't. But first, maybe we should talk about Israel a little.
Yeah, let's talk about the Jebel Druze for a second, and then Israel's role in that. And the Jebel Druze, here's a classic problem of a minority and the need to centralize. Ahmed Shara takes Damascus. He doesn't own the Jebel Druze. He doesn't own South. Israel, the first day, just about the first day that he came to power, Israel said, "We don't trust this guy. He's al-Qaeda. I don't care what America or Europe is going to say. Leopard doesn't change its spots. We don't want his military next to our border. Israel bombed 400 different military depots, all the remaining airplanes, the entire Syrian Navy, missile depots, you name it. Israel went after everything they could find left over from Assad's army so that he would start from zero and wouldn't be able to hurt Israel. Now, Israel also said he cannot move troops south of Damascus near the Golan, and we are going to take special protection of the Druze because we have Druze in Israel, and we're going to make sure the Druze minority is protected. Mm-hmm. So that leaves the Druze, which are 3% of the population, live in this hilly region, sitting there in between Israel and Damascus. The Druze, it must be said, have already established a quasi-independent or autonomous government in their region because Assad largely left them to their own devices because he didn't have enough troops and he didn't want to hurt them because they're a minority.
Did he not even control the policing?
Well, he did. At first he did, but increasingly the Druze pushed out regime troops. And a year before Assad was overthrown, the Druze had completely expelled regime forces and were running the place themselves with several militias. There are 3 Druze religious leaders that tried to come up with a policy. And so the Jebel Druze is autonomous today. This is a challenge for the government because the government, in order to be a sovereign government and develop the country, needs to take charge. So the government immediately said, everybody needs to lay down their guns and we're the sovereigns and we're going to have a monopoly on all force. So everybody, whether it's Alawites or the Kurds or the this or the that, everybody's going to lay down their guns, the militias. But of course, a lot of people did, but most people kept some under the bed, or they said, and the Druze refused. They said, we're not going to turn our guns. And the Druze leaders said, we don't trust you. We don't trust this constitution because it gives us no power. There's no democracy. You're Al-Qaeda. And it must be said that Al-Qaeda previously had mistreated the Druze, had killed about 20 in one town up in the north. So the Druze were very leery and they refused. They did negotiate and said, okay, we'll allow the central government to have control and to have a governor, but we want the local troops to be from the local people because we don't really trust your troops. And this was a point of contention. And they came with a preliminary agreement, but it was never accepted, never hammered out. Things fell apart in the Alawite region and the Druze began to put up their shields. And then there was this squabble on the 13th of June between Bedouin and Druze. A Bedouin guy kidnapped a Druze merchant and took him away. The Druze attacked the Bedouin attacked the Druze, and it went tit for tat. And pretty soon there were 10 people dead, a little bit more. The government then said, this is a terrible situation. Only the central government can enforce order, and we're moving our troops in. And they called for the troops to go to the Jebel Druze. They entered into the Jebel Druze by the 15th, and there were massacres. The hospital, BBC just did a report today. I had published a bunch of videos that were taken in the hospital that show dozens of people, doctors, nurses, patients, all shot. The testimonials are coming out now because BBC has gotten in there, and they've interviewed tons of people from the hospital. It was a massacre.
This is Druze killed by government-affiliated forces.
Yes, and now there's a bunch of people who are saying no, these were Druze killing themselves. There are tons of people who are trying to throw some mud into this and say it's not true, but all the legitimate reporting coming out of it It's a massacre by the
And
Druze.
this was June 15th or July 15th?
July, sorry,
Okay.
July 15th, just recently. And then the government called for the Bedouin tribes, and the Bedouin tribes called a general mobilization and began to stream down in thousands and make these blood-curdling videos and so forth. And the government seemed to encourage them to do this and using them as a whip arm to soften up the Druze so that the Druze would say, no, we want the government forces, not these Bedouin coming in and slaughtering us. And one of the fascinating things about this is the force of the Bedouin, which has emerged on the Syrian scene. And they put up thousands of fighters. They still have their guns. And the question then was whether these are a lot of regime forces who are just taking off their, a lot of the commanders were regime officers who took off their suits and presented themselves as Bedouin. That's what a lot of Druze are claiming, that this is really, this is the government pretending to be the Bedouin so that it can mobilize. All this isn't sorted out. It's murky. But many government forces with government uniforms came in and killed people summarily. And we have it on video after video.
And we should say, I guess, the Druze, like the Alawites, the history of their faith is intertwined with the history of Islam, but they're not considered, in either case, kind of legit. You once compared in a conversation with me the Alawites to kind of Mormons within the Christian church. And so they are...
They add a book and they add a prophet.
Uh-huh.
El-Hakim is the Druze prophet. The Alawites add Ali, who they see as an incarnation of God. He's a less...
But wait, is that the same Ali who, according to Shia, generally was martyred? Or it
yes.
is? Uh-huh.
Well, yes. He's the son-in-law
of the prophet.
Cousin, son-in-law. And so, but he is deified by the Alawites, which is going way too far. And it's considered, so they're considered to be apostates because they've gone off. Okay. They've become, splitters. Okay. And they've gone off.
And I assume the Druze, on the one hand, in resisting centralized authority, may feel emboldened by the backing of Israel, since it has overwhelming power compared to Syria. On the other hand, I know there's ambivalence among some Druze about being identified as Israeli proxies, because Israel is fairly widely considered an enemy within Syria, certainly given the extent of the military attacks on Syria in recent years, well, including during the Assad period, but certainly after the fall of the regime.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the Druze were in a very difficult position. On the one hand, they wanted protection. And so I think we're gratified that Israel was willing to stop this full-scale attack, because Israel threatened Sharaa. He then bombed the Ministry of Defense and put several bombs right through the middle of it. Now, Netanyahu alerted the Turks first, and the Turks told him that this was going to happen and that he better withdraw all his people. So people were not killed in the Ministry of Defense by Israel, but the Ministry of Defense was destroyed. And I think Netanyahu let Sharaa know that if he didn't withdraw his troops, stop this assault, that he might be next. And a warning missile was sent to the palace, the president's palace outside it. But it was a shot across the bow. And I think he got the message and he withdrew his troops. But it leaves the situation in a very unhappy situation, with many Syrians saying that the Druze are traitors. They've turned to Israel, who's massacring Palestinians and is now going to massacre Syrians, and that these are traitors who deserve to be treated as such. And the Druze are left in between. And so it's a very, I have Israeli Druze friends on both sides of the spectrum. I just, one, Ibrahim just published an article saying the Druze shouldn't get sucked into this Israeli protection racket because they won't be able to stand up for them and protect them in the long run. And this is just going to bring hell down in their heads. But many other Israeli Druze are saying, no, they're going to get massacred if they don't take Israeli help. And Israel is the only thing that can save them. And when I said something nice about Ibrahim's article, which was saying, don't trust Israel, many Druze, Syrian Druze, jumped in and said, you expect us just to lay down and get slaughtered by these troops? We were getting massacred. Whole families were being massacred. And but that's the dilemma that the Druze are in.
And what do you think the chances are that Israel ultimately is willing to send in ground troops in a big way to defend the Druze, presumably with an eye to just hanging on the territory, as Israel's done in the past? They did in the Golan Heights. And I gather there's a little bit of Syrian territory even beyond the Golan Heights proper that Israel is now occupying. Do you think that lies in the future?
I can't see that happening, Bob, because the city of Deraa, a big city, Arab city, sits in between the Jebel Druze and the Golan Heights. So for Israel to conquer beyond the Golan zone that they've taken to the Jebel Druze, they've got to deal with all these Arab villages and this big city, Deraa, which would mean, hundreds of thousands or 100,000 plus new Arabs. And Israel's already choking on its Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza. The last thing it wants to do, I think, is get involved in it. Now, there may be some Israelis who are pushing for that, but right now it's a step too far for Israel. So what Israel has done is just threatened Sharaa and said, you just better withdraw your troops or we're going to go after you. And that presents America with a real problem, because Ambassador Barak and President Trump embraced Sharaa, said he is the legitimate sovereign. We're going to help him. We want stability, and everybody should deal with him, and has been urging Israel to sit down and negotiate a peace deal. The Israelis and the Syrians have sat down. Sharaa has said, I want an agreement with the Israelis, but Israel said, no, we don't trust him. And that's the situation. And Sharaa is extraordinarily weak right now for Israel to make major concessions to him.
Yeah. And the Trump administration, I don't know where this stands, but Trump said he was going to drop the sanctions on Syria, which Israel wasn't delighted about. But clearly he had hoped to draw Syria, into the kind of international community. And I gather Israel not only isn't enthusiastic about that, but isn't enthusiastic about Syria ever having a lot of state capacity and, ever being really a powerful state, even in the minimal sense of controlling all the territory in your borders. And I increasingly get the sense that this reflects Israel's larger worldview that, look, all their neighbors are always going to hate them, and the goal is to keep their neighbors weak. And so you assassinate who you have to assassinate, you bomb who you have to bomb. Because, and one reason I say is after the Assad regime fell, everyone who knew more about this than me was saying, well, this new regime, notwithstanding the history of the leader, this is not going to be a problem for Israel. When you look at, where their incentives are, of course, Turkey isn't on super close relations with Israel, but, Turkey's a responsible stakeholder in the region in a sense, and the new Syrian regime has to stay on good terms with them. The U.S. has the sanctions lever, blah, 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 blah. There's no danger of Syria becoming an ally of Iran, which Israel really doesn't want. Nonetheless, that seemed to be the conventional wisdom to me, and yet Israel immediately, in effect, declared war on the new Syria, and as you said, wiped out all remaining military capacity, completely unprovoked. So that just confirmed my view that Israel's idea is hatred of Israel is a universal constant. You just have to make sure there are no strong states in your vicinity. Does that seem like an overstatement to you?
No, I think that's, Israel is very distrustful. And although the United States looks at Turkey as a partner, NATO partner, an important country, we've got bases there. We work with Turkey very closely. We need Turkey on our side with Russia and, Ukraine, you name it. Turkey is an extremely valuable country for the United States. The last thing that Trump wants is for Turkey and Israel to be at war with each other and to suck America in between and have to make a choice between these two strategic allies in the region. That's why he's been pressuring Israel to sit down, make a deal, and let's end this hostility. But from Netanyahu's point of view, he sees Turkey as an Erdogan, as an enemy that's getting stronger. Erdogan has invited Hamas leaders to Istanbul, has spoken out on their behalf, so forth and so on. So Netanyahu made it very clear, I don't trust Turkey. Turkey is, now that Iran has been taken down a few notches and has been driven out of Syria, our new big enemy is Turkey. We do not want Turkey to build up the Syrian army because they are going to turn it into a powerhouse, potentially, and it'll be a Trojan horse for their own army. And they'll be on our borders, and we don't want that.
Mm-hmm.
And hence, for example, there's several airfields in this very center near Palmyra of Syria. Turkey has begun to clear off the highways and get them ready for a new Syrian air force. And Israel's bombed those fields and made it very clear they don't want Turkey moving in, and they don't want an air force, and they're going to maintain their air dominance over Syria. That's one of the big outcomes of the downfall or the civil war in Syria and the downfall of Assad is that Israel now has complete air dominance over Syria, as it does over Lebanon, Iraq, and ultimately, and today, Iran. So Israel has carved out this big swath over potentially hostile countries, and it can fly its planes over, spy, and do what it needs to. It doesn't want to give that up. Sitting down with Sharaa, with American mediators, that's the first thing he's going to ask for. It's no more Israeli planes flying over, bombing what they want. We consider this a hostile act, and you can't fly over our land. We're sovereigns. Israel doesn't want to give that up. So that's the Netanyahu is going to use the Druze, in a sense, as an excuse to keep pummeling Sharaa.
So ethnic conflict in Syria kind of works to his advantage. I mean, he has an interest in ongoing disorder in Syria at some level. I don't mean they're going to send in people and constantly foment it, but in a certain sense, he just wants to be surrounded by weak states. And so a certain amount of internal dissension and conflict must look pretty attractive to him.
You're right. And, this brings up Israeli foreign policy towards Arab states, which has changed dramatically over the years. When Ben-Gurion, first created this state, and Israel in 1948 became an independent state, a guy named Sasson, I'm forgetting his first name right now, was the head of the Arab Bureau. He was an Iraqi Jew who had good relations with Arab leaders. And he came to the determination, because Israel was debating, do we work with the minorities and try to undermine Arab regimes and make minority allies? And ultimately, Israel decided, no, we're not going to do that. That's not a fruitful policy. We've got to deal directly with the Arab states and try to make peace with them. At the same time, Israel began to build up its strategy of the far friends, of the non-Arab friends. So Israel began to build very good relations with the Turks and the post-Ataturk regime, which was secular, and the Iranians under the Shah. And that was the Israeli policy, is look at, we'll try to deal with the Arab governments. If they don't deal with us, which they may not, we're going to be able to have friends with these big countries, Turkey, Iran. Now, today, with the collapse, with the growth of power, and particularly after October 7th, and the formation of this super right-wing Israeli government, that policy is very changed, the policy towards dealing with Arab states. Today, the attitude is, we don't trust Arab states. They say one thing, they do something else. They want our destruction. yes, Egypt and Jordan have made agreements with us, but we aren't going to trust, whether it's in Lebanon, whether it's in Syria, and we're going to work with the minorities in both those states,
Hmm.
and we're not going to deal with the governments as an equal.
Okay. So, Josh, as you know, on these podcasts, we do a fair amount of this for the entire public. That we have something called overtime. This for paid subscribers to the Nonzero newsletter, which I encourage everyone to become. You've been kind enough to stick around a little for overtime. Um, Before we go into overtime, I do want to deliver on my promise to get back to the question of how optimistic or pessimistic you feel. If you could give us kind of the concise version of that, and then maybe we'll explore the basis for it further and over time. But how are you feeling right now about Syria's future?
Well, right now I'm feeling quite negative because of what's just happened this last week in the Jebel Druze. Um, Shaddai is not getting a grip on his forces. He's not insisting, he's not talking to the minorities and bringing them into government and trying to reassure them in any way. He's trying to use force in order to bring them to heel and show them that if they don't comply, very bad things happen to them.
Yeah.
That's not a productive, I think, in the long run, that may lead to a form of ethnic cleansing and get rid of the minorities. And we've seen minorities throughout the Middle East decreasing in numbers very rapidly. And this is something that I've written about and talked about it quite a bit as the great sorting out, which is that nation building is very brutal and it's a zero-sum game for minorities in the region. And
Doesn't have to be in principle, but it has tended to be. Yeah.
well, it is. It is not a principle, but it worked in Central Europe in building Czechoslovakia and then a Czech
Hmm.
Slovak state.
Hmm. Hmm.
Poland used to be 32% minorities. It's 100% Polish today. Ukraine, not Ukraine. Ukraine is falling across these lines, but Yugoslavia broke into 7 ethnic states.
Right.
In many ways, in the Middle East today, religion is a new ethnicity. It's an ethnic marker. It's becoming an ethnic marker. You've got Jews, you've got Palestinians, increasingly defined. It's yes, they're national definitions, but it's crossover between religion and nation. And you're seeing the same thing happening with Sunnis and Shia. And we saw this in Turkey, for example, which was 20% Christian in 1914. By the time Ataturk consolidated the new nation state of Turkey in 22, no more Christians. They're gone. 150 Armenians were massacred. 150 Greek Orthodox were driven out. Many of them sent to Greece.
150.
Excuse me, 1.5
Yeah.
Greek Orthodox driven out. Most of them went to Greece. Many fled into Syria. But 1 out of every 4 Greeks has DNA from Anatolia or Anatolian Greeks.
Hmm.
And which explains partly why Greece and Turkey are at such enemies today. But you take even Cyprus, which, if you look at the demographic map before the 74 Turkish invasion, the Muslim cities and towns were cheek by jowl, scattered all over with Christian towns.
Hmm.
After 74, boom, all the Muslims run up north, protected by Turkey, all the Christians to the south, protected by Greece. And the two are completely separated. You look at what's going on with the Palestinians today in Israel, and it's part of this great sorting out. And are they likely to get a state of their own? Probably not. Doesn't look like it. And this is, it's a zero-sum game for minorities. I call this the class of 1919, these nation states all the way from Poland down to Palestine that were created at the Paris Peace Conference. And multi-ethnic, multi-religious, carved out of these empires, the 4 big empires that were destroyed in World War I. And almost all of them have failed spectacularly in trying to incorporate their minorities as part of this tapestry, national tapestry. What's happened is those minorities have been driven out, and you get the building of a political community where people trust each other, have a common political identity, but it's usually based on a religious identity. It's national too, but it's also religious,
Hmm.
and that's what we're seeing happening across the Middle East in many ways.
Okay, so in overtime, I want to pursue this a little further. I also want to talk about Gaza and Iran a little. Again, I encourage people to get access to overtime. If you go to nonzero.org and click on the post associated with this podcast, there's a way to become a member and just get the rest of the video and audio immediately there. But also, there's a way to set up your podcast feed so you will forevermore have access to overtimes. But anyway, thanks to everybody who's stuck with us so far. Now we're heading into overtime.